The Magick Bookshop by Calla Trobe. Prologue. Let me tell you about our shop. It's the sort of place that makes people go, ooh, as soon as they step into it, and then maintain a respectful silence throughout their sojourn. It smells like a church, what with the combination of aged pages and the incense we burn for our various purposes. It is, however, smaller and more uniquely sacred than a conventional place of worship, and is crammed to the rafters with ancient tomes. The books both lure and intimidate, for who can resist the siren call of a fat 15th century vellum binding nestling on a slanting shelf, and then fail to feel slighted when its contents turn out to be indecipherable? Most of our texts are in Latin, some with Greek parallel texts. The rest are in Hebrew, German, French, and good old English. Luckily, ours is the sort of shop in which one is drawn, 9 times out of 10, to the book of optimum personal relevance at the time. The magical skills of the owner, Mr. Malinowski, cause this to be so. We have some interesting early specimens written in the vernacular, as I always point out to those whose intuition is failing them, and whose linguistic skills are limited to modern tongues. To most of our clients, however, this is not an obstacle. We are situated in the heart of Oxford, and many of our customers are academics, or as we call them, denizens of Hod. Mr. Malinowski, a Polish Jew who fled to England during the Second World War, is a practicing Kabbalist, and so am I. There are not many jobs which specify an active interest in esoterica as a desirable quality, so I was delighted to be made, 5 years ago, manager of Malinowski's, antiquarian specialist in ancient cultures and their religions. Mr. Malinowski learned to be euphemistic during the war. He is brave, but not stupid. Oxford may harbour as many anthropologists as it does Christians, but an overtly magical bookshop would meet the disapproval of the religious and the atheist alike. There is nowhere on earth as Hod-like as Oxford, except perhaps for Harvard. In this particular enterprise, we work beneath the sign of the caduceus, the dual-winged serpents twined about a central staff selected by the mage to hang outside the shop. Burnt gold on a square board of Osiris green, the snakes undulate with the rising and setting of the sun, and with the levels of magic at work in this small city. Thus propitiated, Hermes lends his plays of gainful chance to our book exchange, and psychospiritual artistry to the enterprise. Despite the threat of much larger businesses and online bargain rivals, Malinowski's has thrived for many years now. Less successful booksellers consider this to be very mysterious indeed. The glass of the shop windows is thick and, from the outside, slightly convex, like the eye of a goldfish. Oxford flows around us, a river of modernity in which we swim immune to what Mr. Malinowski calls polluting mind waves. He is usually in London, where he owns 2 other outlets, clad in an astral vestment of bright, protective violet. Just occasionally he pops in with a delivery and sits at the till, drinking tea so sweet and strong you could stand your spoon up in it, and tells of his bibliophilic activities. He is a man possessed when it comes to books on magic. He has a knack of finding the manuscripts, however obscure and outmoded these may seem, that are most secretly needed by his clientele. They come here to browse in the knowledge that their needs will be met and their privacy respected. Consequently, I have changed the names and locations of several of the customers mentioned, though others to whom I talked about this project have agreed to go metaphorically sky-clad, believing that honesty is not such a bad thing. It is amazing, when you scratch the surface, to find out just how many of us there are who would be prepared to come out of the occult broom closet, if only they could be guaranteed not to be labelled insane or satanic. The latter, of course, is as anathema to us as to any practicing Christian. We are not interested in back-to-front renditions of a new religion. We are spiritual seekers, referring to older, fresher sources for our inspiration. But you'll see that for yourself as you read the tales I've accrued during my time here. One thing that's really obvious to me since working in Malinowski's is the way in which the myths reenact themselves daily, both for our enlightenment and simply because they are well-established patterns. Many would argue for the latter alone, and many that the former was the whole point, but for me, both seem pertinent. I've seen the old ones walk into this very shop and buy a book. I've asked them if they'd like a carrier bag for that and directed them to the nearest tea room or public loo. They are living energies archetypal, and much more, divine, yet functioning on the earth plane, Malkuth, just like the rest of us. Sometimes they are barely aware of their own sublimity. Sometimes they have a foot so firmly planted in both worlds that they can be integrated humans during the day and conscious spiritual psychopomps by night. As my boss likes to point out, it's a fascinating level we inhabit. One of the first principles Mr. Malinowski taught me was that Kether, the ultimate divine, may be found at the heart of Malkuth, the material kingdom in which we commonly abide, and that the creative intelligence exists inside us as much as vice versa. The journey to God is internal, but reflected on the outer planes. The body and matter are sacred. It's taken me ages to take that on board, and I still forget it sometimes. Mr. Malinowski knows how to draw the magic out of life as a snake tamer can extract the venom from the serpent and use it to heal. Magical awareness can be a venom, he taught me, if ignored or wrongly used. I certainly suffered from the former in my teens. I was scared by my differences and tried to stash them away in my subconscious, the Yesodic plane of the Kabbalah. There they augmented, occasionally causing delightful astral projections, but mainly manifesting here as severe neuroses. Mr. Malinowski is a great healer and psychotherapist and showed me how to retrieve my positive powers and put them to good use. Now, every day is a metaphor for inner reality, and not just in a heavy sense. We can laugh at it, at ourselves, and dismiss some as dross, and so can our favourite customers. For when every tiny diurnal detail seems of wild import, with new angles flashing in by the moment, that way madness can lie. This semiotic hyperactivity, along with mistaking ego dialogue for spirit interaction, is a fundamental pitfall awaiting the seeker after spirit. We advise taking a deep breath and a healthy dose of Om. Chapter 1. Magick. The week I started at Malinowski's was the same that the newspapers carried the headlines. Majority of Britons no longer believe in God. And God is dead, Nietzsche. Nietzsche is dead, God. The British Humanist Association had just conducted a Maury poll and discovered that while 67% of the population considered themselves religious, only 43% believed in a God. Not only this, but it rained and rained interminably. Mr. Malinowski was undeterred. "The rain is a wonderful sign, Viv," he told me as he handed me an antiquarian specimen with a binding like brie rind. "The rain is a symbol of knowledge, like this book. It comes from Chokmah, the sphere of wisdom on the tree of life. It is God's thoughts descending on Malkuth, the earth plane. Yes, the rain falls effortlessly from the unfathomable mind of God, cleansing and fertilizing all that it touches, even in these medieval streets. The trick is to make ourselves a vessel for this Chokmah rain, so that we can collect and hold and overflow with God's wisdom." "That's a lovely way of looking at it," I mused, putting this weather immunity down to his Polish origins as much as to his mystical bent. As a Leo prone to winter depression, I need my sunshine for multiple reasons. And many Britons, as well as complaining endlessly about the dull weather, the rain, the filthy cats and dogs of it all, will bitterly rebuke the sun when he finally shows his face for being too hot, too bright, too like the flipping Kalahari out there. Atheism and atmospheric intolerance seem to go hand in hand. "Not just lovely, also true," announced my new employer, his blue-violet eyes dancing with merriment beneath salt and pepper eyebrows. "All of life is an analogy of the mind of God. Magick teaches us this. There is no such thing as bad weather, only a bad attitude to God's many moods." I looked through the dusty, darkened windows at his silver streaks outside, feeling that pleasure that can only come when the rain is pummeling on the roof and flags, a cold wind weaving in and out of the liquid columns or blowing them sideways into wet explosions on passers-by, and one is warm and snug inside. A shiver of contentment passed through me. "Yes, we are like a capsule, floating on the river," remarked Mr. Malinowski, a phrase which was soon to become familiar to my ears. "A bubble which many might like to burst, but we shan't let them, shall we, my dear?" I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" I ventured. "Ah, my dear, so young, so much to learn. The first thing you should know is that every action has its equal and opposite reaction. For every good thing we believe and do, there will spring up an adverse reaction. You and I belong to the pillar of mercy, but there are just as many adherents to the pillar of severity. Not a bad thing per se, we need the balance. But then we have the flip side. Flip, yes, I'm afraid we do, the clipoth. The husks or harlots, as we call them. They are impure spirits of evil intent, and there are just as many in Oxford as anywhere else, Viv, or possibly more. But I don't wish to alarm you, my dear, though forewarned is forearmed, as they say. You will learn a great deal working here. It is a focal point of many energies, as you will see. Had Mr. Malinowski not been so gentlemanly, so well educated and respected, I might have been deterred at this point. Actually, that's a lie. As a 24-year-old of dubious psychological and fiscal foundation, I knew I had more than a hint of the vulnerable about me, daily LBRPs notwithstanding, and I might have felt I ought to be deterred. But the lure of the shop, with its wondrous rows of tomes and spectral nooks, and the fact that my boss was merely vocalizing what I already thought, but was unaccustomed to saying out loud, far outweighed my desire to be sensible. I smiled at him with genuine confidence. I can't wait, I said. I did not have to. 2 minutes later, a blur of brown barber coat crashed through the door, shedding silver beads of God's wisdom from its waxy surface, and generous streams of Chokmahik insight from the numerous bags clutched in the red hands of its breathless owner. The pigskin carpet, a relic apparently from medieval times, was soon as sodden around the gentleman's feet as was the beard over which he stared bespectacled. His eyes were large and rather frantic, and as they met Mr. Malinowski's, the man, who was in his mid-40s I estimated, flushed like a teenager. "I'll just put my bags down if I may," he exhaled, depositing at the foot of the mahogany counter 7 or 8 extremely heavy-looking carriers from Blackwell's and the Oxford University Press bookshops. "Certainly, sir," nodded Mr. Malinowski mildly. "And how may we help you?" The man glanced at us both, then swept the shop with his eyes. They nearly bulged, and he began to hyperventilate again. "I just want to look around and buy some books, if that's all right." As he spoke, the man headed for the fine bindings shelf, his hands shaking as if palsied, with the strain of his shed load or with something else. He grabbed 2 or 3 beauties from the middle, then hurried to the next section, the incunabula, and pulled off the fattest specimens, piling them all up in his arms. "You might like to put these on the counter, sir, where you can study your selection," ventured Mr. Malinowski, visibly concerned for the welfare of his books. Each was like a child to him. He knew its history. He had nursed it through the traumas of sympathetic renewal and meticulous cleaning. He had reacted with its inner essence. The customer, however, seemed reluctant to put his prizes down. "I'm accustomed to carrying heavy weights," he announced, his eyes scanning the aisles and displays like a ravenous child on an Easter egg hunt. He lunged for the next shelf, a row of historical tomes written in French. This was too much for Mr. Malinowski, who jumped to his well-polished feet and was at the gentleman's side in a flash, remarkably agile for a septuagenarian, I thought. "Please, dear sir, allow me," he cajoled, gently edging some of the pricier specimens from the man's damp and vice-like grip. Our customer did not know whither to look, at the articles rent from him, or at the other waiting to be seized. "Don't go putting them back," he cried in my direction. "I want to take them all." Mr. Malinowski caught my eye and raised an eloquent eyebrow. "Study him," it said. Was this our first case of clinical bibliomania, I wondered? The customer, however, was quick to complete his business, arriving at the counter within 5 minutes, bearing 2 further armloads of eclectic texts, and requiring that they all be totted up. Nervously, I put the books through the till. The words, "That will be £3,054, please," did not slip as easily off my tongue as I would have liked them to. The man, still flushed and shaking and breathing like a fox just ahead of the hunt, put his hand inside the Barber jacket and withdrew a pile of £50 notes the size of a loaf. I looked at Mr. Malinowski, unsure whether to accept them or not, and then remembered the pen we keep on the till to tell whether the currency is genuine. The man flicked 61 of his notes from the mass like a croupier, and placed them on the till with a flourish. I tested each with the pen as swiftly as possible, trying not to blush. Mr. Malinowski kept him talking all the while. "So, you are a polymath, sir?" he asked pleasantly. "What a rare quality that is these days." "Well, a polyglot anyway," gushed our customer. "I was at the varsity many years ago, studied classics. Ah, is that a Euripides folio there in the cabinet?" "It is indeed, Mr. Magwitch. Poor Magwitch," he smiled. Mr. Malinowski held out his hand, and as they touched, I saw a flash of perception pass across the face of my new employer. Magwitch tried to converse politely, but he was clearly agitated by the desire to extract the Euripides from behind its glass. Mr. Malinowski nodded at me to pass the key, which I did, sending a £50 note zigzagging onto the pig-hide carpet. I retrieved it with a sense of money being rather like leaves on an autumn breeze. Magwitch's ideas must be catching. "It's 18th century diced Russia," intoned Mr. Malinowski, lovingly identifying the relevant faded backstrip. "Look at this gilt back. Beautiful, is it not? And we find within engraved portraits of Euripides and of Joshua Barnes, the publisher." Mr. Magwitch could not wait to get his hands on the specimen. He clutched it to his chest, not even looking inside, as if his very life depended on it. Within moments, he had deposited a further 10 of his red notes on the counter. I wrapped the books as carefully as possible, considering their quantity and the speed of the transaction, while my boss tried to extract conversation from our unusual customer. The latter was soon so flustered that the ancient man of Magick had to give up his till-side seat to the hefty younger chap. "Thanks," breathed Magwitch, undoing his waterproof for the first time. Beneath it, I glimpsed a very fine tie of embroidered silk, a crisp, clean shirt, and an exceptionally well-tailored suit. These did not seem in keeping with his demeanour, which remained on the frantic side of sane. His eyes still flitted hungrily from shelf to shelf, and I could sense Mr. Malinowski's reluctance to lose further of his children to the man. "That's quite a selection you have there, Mr. Magwitch," attempted the older gentleman once more. "So many beautiful things," sighed Magwitch. "So little time." "Would you like a box for these?" I asked, placing the last of the brown paper over the medley of books. "It might help you carry them." "Carry them?" Magwitch looked confused. "Oh, carry them. Yes, well, if you wouldn't mind waiting for me, I'll fetch my car. Oh, and bags are fine." He looked dazed. "Just fine." He arose immediately and bumbled out of the shop. "Do many of your customers spend that much money in one go?" I asked, at once impressed and disturbed. "And cash too. If it weren't for your intuition, Mr. Malinowski, I would worry about that transaction." "And you would be quite right to do so," replied the mage. "Indeed, there is much cause for concern for that gentleman." "He didn't really want those books, did he?" I asked tentatively. "I mean, he desired them as objects, but he didn't even look inside most of them." "Quite so, quite so." I waited for an explanation, but Mr. Malinowski sat like a sphinx and gazed out of the window at the shiny slabs and slate-grey shadows slanting across the medieval college walls opposite. The shelves creaked, readjusting themselves after Magwitch's onslaught. The pharmaceutical breath of the 13 generations of midwives named Beth, who once inhabited this premises, caressed my cheek, though I did not know what it was at that point. I put it down to the herbs in the desk and a draught seeping through one of the shop's many fissures. In a trice, a Mercedes had pulled up at the door of the shop, 40s music emanating from it. Magwitch switched off the engine and bounded out, repenetrating our sphere with his book-craving bulk. "Here, allow me to help you," I offered. I bore 4 carrier bags of the books to the boot, in what was now a light drizzle, and waited for him to open it. He emerged along with Mr. Malinowski, each bearing 6 or 7 more carriers containing purchases from our own and other shops. Magwitch pressed a button on a keyring, and the boot opened gracefully. I tried not to gasp, for inside it were amassed the finest woven fabrics of India, and all the glittering jewels of Arabia, it seemed, spilling from antique trunks and trousseaux, alongside delicately wrought troves of sparkling trinkets, elegant bottles of exotic oils and perfumes, and everything that winked and shimmered and shone with expensive luster. "Ah, we're running out of room in there," flushed Mr. Magwitch. We'll have to stash these little gems on the back seat. Was he some kind of master thief? I wondered. The cash, the keenness to get rid of it, the books of plunder, the clothes from, it seemed, a sultan's harem. I tried not to appear suspicious. After all, he had just spent a vast amount of money with us, and deserved our courtesy at the very least, but I could not resist a glance at Mr. Malinowski. He, meanwhile, maintained the perfect pose and profile of a hieroglyph. We bundled the books into the back seat as requested, and waved him off. Noel Coward's body and soul blasted from the car stereo as the engine started. We stepped back inside the shop. No sooner had we returned to the counter than Noel Coward became audible again. The car backed up the road, far too fast, and stopped outside. Magwitch leaped out, his barber flapping like the wings of a panic-stricken chicken as he opened the boot and dived in. Dashing through our door, he lunged at the till, managing somehow to catch both of us in the eye in the process, an earnest look, if ever there was one, and deposited a fistful of something on the till. "For you," he puffed, before bounding out again and pulling off at high speed. I gasped as I beheld the antique silver. A brooch studded with glittering star sapphires and an exquisitely engraved snuff-box. No question which gift was for whom, then. "Take it," said Mr. Malinowski, "and don't worry, we're going to repay him amply for these gifts. Now, time to cash up, I think." I took the sapphire pin and attached it to my dress, admiring the way that the silver and blues contrasted with my native blacks. I had never owned such a beautiful piece of jewellery before, nor ever one so valuable, and I sent Mr. Magwitch a heartfelt thank you on the ether. To my intense frustration, Mr. Malinowski locked up and retired to the basement to do some bookkeeping. I had so many questions to ask him, and would far rather have stayed and whiled away the evening chatting with him than returned to my rented room. I shared an overpriced house with a very nice single mother, Sam, and her 8-year-old daughter Jasmine, but their merry banter was not nearly as intriguing as the verbal ponderings of Mr. Malinowski. As I left, I tentatively invited him for a quick drink at the Turl Bar. "No can do, my dear," he replied through a plume of aromatic pipe smoke. "At my age you appreciate the faculties when they are in normal working order. You do not risk the vices. Tobacco is my one exception, a habit I picked up in the war and find conducive to the brain. You go now, Viv, and I shall see you on the morrow." I nodded, smiled at him through the blue haze, walked up the stairs and across the still, squishy pigskin carpet, and departed the shop. Outside was another world. I was almost shocked when I emerged to find taxis flashing by, queues of workers waiting for the bus, compounding the darkness with their umbrellas, girls in satin cocktail dresses giggling their way down the street, and man-boys in dinner jackets regaling one another with tales of getting so pissed up that night. The usual army of beggars was out, as it will be in any city with a hedonistic elite, hassling folk at every corner for a spare quid or two, some of them looking like they genuinely needed it, others just trying it on. I thought of Magwitch and his 4,000 casual pounds, and wondered what he was doing right now. As I did so, stepping out onto the crowded high street to cross it, the deathly white face of a heroin addict swooned into mine, her brown eyes dilated for her drug. They alighted on the sapphire brooch glinting beneath my unbuttoned coat, and seemed to devour it with their gaze. I expected her to grab it. I took a step backward, and my heel hit the gutter. I looked around, steadying myself, and when I looked back, she was gone. The ghostly apparition left me shaken. The hunger in her stare was palpable and seemed very familiar. With a jolt, I remembered seeing the same need in the eyes of Magwitch. I walked home with much on my mind, glad now to be returning to Sam and Jasmine and television and talk about trivia. A good dose of the ordinary felt like exactly what I needed. The following morning I traversed the warm, wet streets with anticipation, unlocking the ancient door with a frisson of pure excitement, fully prepared for some sort of occult event. Even outside the shop, the air seemed laden with portent, a whiff of mysterious incense on the breeze. However, when my boss arrived, clad in his eternal black raincoat and grey suit and purple tie, he declined to comment on our spendthrift friend. I reluctantly decided not to force the issue, intending to be an accomplice rather than a nuisance, especially in my first week. Instead, I made us tea and sat studying books at the counter while Mr. Malinowski taught me about them. The first printing presses, the way rags were used in paper, the first great scholars and collectors. I noticed him once or twice turning the snuff-box contemplatively in his hands, but the morning, though interesting, felt anticlimactic. Instead of the mystical atmosphere to which I was steadily becoming accustomed, it seemed almost like a normal shop. To make matters worse, at around 11, when Mr. Malinowski had just nipped downstairs, we were beleaguered by a chemistry don who had dropped by for a quarrel, it seemed. "Ancient medicine," he barked from the door. "We have some Galen," I replied, and light-heartedly, "or there's Lavater's physiognomy." "Poppycock," he shouted. "Galen I have, and I suppose all the rest of your stock is this spirituality nonsense." I gave him a look as blank as untouched parchment. It did not seem worth responding to the man. Mr. Malinowski emerged from the basement at just that point and offered his assistance. The Don strained at the leash of politeness. "I wondered whether you might have anything as scientific as a medicine book, but your girl tells me not." Mr. Malinowski smiled wryly. "I take it from that, sir, that you are one of the godless 57%, the man grimaced. "I should certainly hope so. Scientific explanation is the only way forward, but people are too lazy and impatient to wait for science to tell them the truth. It takes time, yes, and applied effort, and reason, along with decades of learning to even begin to scratch the surface of the universe." Mr. Malinowski raised an eyebrow. "And I suppose that most people are too uneducated and low in IQ to understand it anyway." "Quite so, quite so. They want an instant answer. These peddlers of God, of so-called spirituality, whatever that's supposed to be, give it to them. Hey presto! Religion is nothing but instant gratification for the feeble-minded. We are heading for a repetition of the Dark Ages. I detest this kind of person. I am not ashamed to admit it. They wring all the joy out of life and cauterize all natural possibilities. As far as I can see, the study of creation does not disprove it, or identify the primal cause. I cannot be bothered arguing the toss with the arrogant denizens of Hod or Tifereth, for religious zealots are certainly just as bad. My boss, however, absolutely loved it. I suppose his years of experience and learning had lent him a gravitas that I lack, so people like this Don would happily engage in a game of cerebral chess with him, whereas younger folk, particularly women, were not worth wasting their time upon. I seemed like yet another student to him, no doubt, only less well-educated and almost definitely more impecunious. Disgusted by the whole scenario, Mr. Malinowski's girl took a pointedly early lunch break. When I returned, at a snail's pace, one avocado wrap later, Mr. Malinowski was sitting behind the till, puffing on his pipe with the air of one greatly entertained. "Have a good debate?" I asked as I headed to the back room to make us both tea. "Human arrogance never ceases to amaze me, Viv," he smiled, raising his voice so that I could hear him in the tiny kitchen. "Scientists insist there is no divinity, we just evolved. But who set evolution into motion? With their stupid narrow minds, propped up by degrees and doctorates, they won't believe anything unless they can weigh it and measure it and analyze it chemically. And in their arrogance, they completely miss the marvel of it all." Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, sums it up beautifully. The two men waiting every night for Godot to appear and, like a commercial traveler, explain existence to them so that they can decide whether or not to accept it. Yes, a little thought or learning can engender a great deal of obstructive arrogance, rendering its proponents less educated than a religious peasant, who at least feels the awe of the divine, the glory that is creation, especially evident in nature. I brought the tea through, Mr. Malinowski's as tan as can be imagined and thick with sugar. Mine seemed like nothing but water and milk in comparison. We have to accept our own experiences, these being all we can truly rely on. Faith is not enough, in this the professor is correct, but personal encounters and experiences, particularly, though not solely, when these can be corroborated by independent witnesses, these are our guiding lights. I have believed and experienced the inexplicable more times than I have smoked this pipe. He smiled and tapped the venerable object. "What kind of thing?" I asked, thrilled that the conversation was going in this direction again. I knew that after my initiatory week, Mr. Malinowski would be leaving for London, and that this represented one of my few chances to chat with him. Well, let us see. The most interesting thing that happened to me early on in life was reading the thoughts of two men. I call this brain radio. When I was a student in Vienna, though I did not know at the time from whence these voices came. They were thoughts so vile that they made me physically unwell. I had to visit the university sick bay. 3 days later, I was arrested by the Gestapo on a serious charge of affiliation to a political resistance movement, and kept in prison for 2 months. Later, I learned that these two men had come to my house to inquire about me, exactly when I had those warnings, if only I had understood the symptoms. In that prison cell, I learned to listen and to transmit also. That was just the beginning, of course. Later on, thanks to this brain radio, I narrowly escaped my own murder. "Good heavens," I replied, rather inadequately. Mr. Malinowski was just about to regale me with more details, when the door flew open, and in came, yes, you've guessed it, Magick. He was clad in another fine suit, some overpriced designer gentleman's garb, such as one finds in such cities of inherited wealth, though I doubted his own was gifted from birth. No overcoat this time, as the summer rain had let off for a moment, and today's purchases were not evident about his person, though I felt sure that he had made some. He was still short of breath. "Hello again," he gasped at me. "Ah, good, you're wearing your brooch. It's so nice when people know how to accept a gift in the spirit with which it was intended. I shall have to bring you some more presents, Viv. Good day to you too, sir." Mr. Malinowski extended his hand, gave me a quick glance, and shook the generous paw of Magick. As he did so, I saw a change come over our customer's aura. Something white and diaphanous exuded from it, visibly, like smoke or albumen, and in it I glimpsed, lit for the briefest of moments, the same brown eyes and hungry look I had encountered in the road the evening before. Shock jolted through me, and had I not been sitting down, I surely would have raised a cloud of dust from the shelves behind the counter. Mr. Malinowski chatted to the man as if nothing at all had occurred. Age and experience certainly have a lot to be said for them, I reflected. Today, Mr. Magick made only the most modest of buys, a set of Ovid at £300 in beautiful biscuit calf, and a couple of Theosophy first editions. I could sense Mr. Malinowski restraining him, for though Magick was champing at the bit, my boss led him away from the items of desire on several occasions. "You don't really need that, sir, do you?" he said, gently but firmly, and our customer acquiesced. This was a peculiar type of salesmanship I was learning, I thought. Most shopkeepers would be delighted to have such an undiscriminating customer with a pile of cash on their premises. But Mr. Malinowski, as we know, was 1 in a million. Greed and God do not mix, he used to say, and he was right. Like most humans and all business owners, he was wrestled by mammon every day, but Roman Malinowski always won. Very shortly, our customer had reached a pitch of agitation impossible to ignore. "To tell the truth," he panted, "I'm dying to get to Whistles and buy some clothes." "Oh, do you have a daughter?" I asked tentatively. "It's a lovely boutique. Very small sizes, though. Lots of zeros." "No, I am not so blessed," said Magick. "I just love the fabrics, the designs, those little faux fur stoles, and OMG, those silk stockings. And the cocktail dresses are to die for. Fabulousness." I gazed at him, utterly nonplussed. Mr. Malinowski nodded sagely to himself. Was he going to spill the beans soon, I wondered. "Well, have fun," I conjoined. "Viv, come and see what I've already bought this morning," enthused Mr. Magick. "There may be something in there meant just for you." "You bring the car here, sir," conducted Mr. Malinowski. "I cannot spare Viv right now." He looked at my boss for a moment, surprised, even a little hurt. I saw the thought move across his wide face that perhaps he was not trusted by us. His blue eyes, behind their shields of glass, looked even bigger. My heart went out to him suddenly. "I'd love to see your finds," I assured him, "though I'm sure you've given me more than enough already. I adore my brooch. Thank you so much. How about we keep your books here until you fetch your car?" I'll lend you my barrier pass. It went up again this morning. My ambush of thanks and special treatment seemed to do the trick. I'll be back in a moment. Don't go anywhere. And off he rushed. This time, Mr. Malinowski did not keep me in suspense. You saw, I take it, what happened when I shook his hand. She's more tenacious than I had thought, that girl. Do you know what's happening, Viv? I had to guess, at least. After all, this was part of my job now, I reflected happily. Is he possessed or something? I asked, feeling very gauche. The story's a little more complex than that, my dear. You're not far off, though. See what you notice when he returns. Magwich's musical herald again reached us before he did, but today's was very different to yesterday's. I don't believe it, I exclaimed. He's listening to Moby. The hypnotic beat and electronic tones of the super-fast dance track blasted up the street, reaching rave proportions outside the shop. I suddenly regretted giving him the pass. Students on bikes stared and grinned, and upright citizens scowled at the Mercedes-come ghetto blaster. I dashed out and asked him to turn it down. What? He asked, blank and confused. Am I listening to... Oh yes, of course I am, righty-ho! Blissful silence descended on the street. Look, come and look at this, he cried, leaping from the driving seat and heading for the boot once more. Beautiful things, luxurious pretty things, all in abundance. Aren't we the lucky ones now? I followed him outside while Mr. Malinowski lingered in the shop porch. The boot today was a child's treasure trove of dressing-up costumes. There were designer evening dresses of sharp cut and sharper expense, trimmed with mink and polar fox. I, long-term vegetarian, recoiled in horror. Long flowing rivers of strappy silk, cheek skirts in a la mode styles, and a plethora of trendy tops and jeans and satin leggings and multicolored dreamcoats. There was even a vintage 1960s Afghan in there. I gasped covetously. Aren't they gorgeous? He sighed. Then, as if pulling himself together, is there anything in here that you might like? This, perhaps? Grabbing a paisley dress at random. Or these? An embroidered Victorian morning coat plucked from the pile in the same fist as the glorious Afghan. I will admit to being seriously tempted by both of these items. But I had already received more than enough from the unwell man, and who knows what might be attached. I don't think they're quite my size, I said as an excuse. But thank you so much anyway. They're all a size 8 to 10, Magwitch objected peevishly. They'd fit you perfectly. Then, all of a sudden, he slammed the boot down and looked at me with panic. I've just remembered. I've got to go to pick something up from the tailor's. The most beautiful coat. Just wait until you see it. I transferred his purchases to the back seat again, and as he started the engine and Moby blasted out, I saw him grimace at the sound. Then his face became blank, and he drove off, the bass beat thudding from his car. Mr. Malinowski, who had been watching us closely throughout this exchange, escorted me back to our perches at the till. Any developments on your perceptions, Miss von Beiner? He asked playfully. You noticed that the ladies' clothes were all one size. Why do you think that could be? Well, I'm guessing that they're all for one person, I ventured ingeniously. Though who that could be? Someone you've seen before, perhaps, hinted the master of magic. Last night, perhaps. The memory of the nightmare stare of the heroin addict reared up in my mind. He's not connected with her, surely? I asked. There seemed no point in inquiring as to how he knew of this brief encounter, which I had mentioned to nobody. Brain radio, no doubt. Surely he is, young lady, he replied, but think laterally. My mind rummaged through a garbage heap of possibilities, all equally insalubrious. Yet Magwitch, with his blunt kindness and sudden panic attacks, did not seem the sort to keep a girl, or be on drugs, or any of the other connections that leered at me with rotten smiles. Was he dying, perhaps, and spending as fast as he could? Maybe to prevent someone, this girl possibly, from getting his fortune? But then, why were the clothes her size? Besides which, I was unsure as to just how corporeal she was. Perhaps she was not real, after all. The penny has begun to drop, chimed in Mr. Malinowski. She is not alive, this girl. At least, her body is no longer with us. It was terminated 6 months ago, hit by a car. By Mr. Magwitch's car? I asked nervously, already realizing the answer. By his old one, yes. He had it scrapped after that. A Jaguar XJS it was, and the Mercedes replaced it. I read all about it in the local rag. Our friend was rightfully acquitted. She ran straight out in front of him. He wasn't speeding, and there was nothing at all he could do. She was undergoing what they call cold turkey at the time, chasing after some drug dealer on the opposite side of the street. The high street, I concluded, shivering. Precisely where you saw her, yes. So now she's, what, haunting him? Not quite, though that would in some ways be preferable. While Magick was in shock, he's a good man, compassionate. She entered his aura, and she's been moving in and out ever since, drawing sustenance from his vitality just as she used to from her drug. His guilt, for he's a good, conscientious man, gives her easy access to him. He thinks of her all the time, wishes he could have helped change her fate for the better. At the moment, she's satisfying the unacted desires of a lifetime. She never had money. Now she's able to make Magick buy all the things she would have, if able. The books? I asked, confused. Surely she wasn't interested in classics or theosophy? Mr. Malinowski's blue eyes smiled. Unfortunately not. Those are the result of her compulsion to possess, acting on Mr. Magick's own inclinations. His discrimination was impaired on the first trip, but by the second, I had worked out how to make him separate one impulse from another. The jewellery and clothes and the like, however, and that dreadful rap music, they came from the girl. She is trying to solidify her own existence by externalizing her cravings. Before very long, if left to her own devices, this little madam will have Mr. Magick cruising the streets for opiates, if he isn't already, and in full physical crisis. I stared at him. So what are we going to do? Oh, so you want to help him, do you? Definitely, I cried. Of course I do. But there's no of course about it, my dear. I require a shop manager who is interested in the occult, but nowhere in your job description does it say that esoteric first aid is also compulsory. True, I mused, but I'd like to. He seems a good man, underneath. Much nicer than that awful cynic you were chatting to this morning, I added a tad resentfully. Here we have the paradox. A man who denies his own soul will become immune to the perceptions of it, perhaps even lose it. And you are right about Mr. Magick. He is worth helping. Visions of mystical ceremonies in the basement raced through my mind. Would we work at night? Would Mr. Malinowski be transformed by sweeping cloak and ritual dagger into a living thoth, candlelight flickering across the face lined by wisdom, strange chants emanating from some unseen portal into the other world? What would I wear? My black velvet dress, normally reserved for my own rituals? Would I be the priestess, my favorite persona? So you would like to, then? Absolutely, I enthused, envisaging the grand circle, the billowing incense, the watchtowers seething with elementals, me, svelte in my dress at the center of the sphere, majestically calling upon the gods. Mr. Malinowski gave me a long look. I'm sorry to disappoint you, dear, but I think you've been reading too many Dion Fortune novels. Silken robes and silver sandals are all very nice, but I'm a little old for all that palaver now, don't you think? I blushed. Damn this brain radio lark. Nowadays, most of my magical work is done mentally, he explained. Not that I object to the use of ritual to establish a pattern for future use. On the contrary, had I not been involved in so much ceremonial work in the past, it would be far more difficult for me to envisage the correct scenario now. But, as it is. So, we're just going to use our minds? I asked, disappointed. I am a Leo, and I love a bit of pomp and ceremony. We shall be using the same rays and symbols that we use in ritual, only on Magick directly and discreetly, and in the shop. Imagine the scandal if we were accused of involving the vulnerable, the mentally ill, for this is what most people would consider him to be, in rituals in our basement. Oh no, no, no. I've had more than enough interrogations and political religious stone-throwing to last me several lifetimes. Then, what part would you like me to play? I asked tentatively. You, my dear, will send me the rays when I ask for them. Yellow to relax and start to heal him. To freeze that spirit out if she won't come voluntarily. However, we mean to coax her from him, and that's where I really need your help. I need you to visualize, as vividly as possible, a scenario that you think she would enjoy. Somewhere full of life, where she feels part of the hub. We need music, excitement, colour, friends, drinks, her favourite brand of cigarette, drugs, whatever you feel will appeal to her. Your job will be to tempt her away, so that once she's out, I can seal Mr. Magwitch's aura against her coming back in. So she can't discriminate between thought forms and reality? I asked. She cannot discern between Malkuth, the Earth sphere, and Yesod, the astral realm. She has a foot in each, plus other dissipations, but her soul is weighed this way, as gravity itself conspires due to the dark matter accumulated in her soul. The material and emotional spiritual worlds seem equally real, but equally tenuous, to her. That is why I need you to perform a strong and detailed visualization. The more solid it seems, the more it will attract her. Mr. Malinowski retrieved his pipe from his pocket and tapped it thoughtfully. Had she died properly, her soul would have passed up the 30-second path, which links Malkuth and Yesod, and the break to the silver cord would have been clean. Yesodic forms would then have seemed solid to her, and Malkuthic ones insubstantial, as is right for one who has departed their body. As it was, her spirit was already partially dislodged by her habit, and when her body stopped so suddenly, she panicked and lunged for the nearest repository of life force, that of our friend. She is sucking him dry now, etherically and physically. He hasn't the physique to keep up with a teenage girl's schedule. She's been making him go out to bars and clubs at night, compelling him to dance for her and mix with a bad crowd and make an utter fool of himself. Most of the time, he cannot even remember how he got there or how to get home. And when we've dislodged her, what then? I could all too easily imagine the girl's furious response when my vision faded and she found herself tricked and locked out of her favourite link with life. Cue poltergeist, or at least very angry ghost. Then we will guide her to where she is really meant to be, he replied. In the care of Gabriel and Raphael, until her next birth time comes around. Don't worry, Vivienne, my dear. We won't just leave her hanging between planes. That would be most unethical and irresponsible. Well, if I'm going to walk with her personally, I'd better know her name, I reflected, somewhat relieved. Do you remember it? Mr. Malinowski opened one of the lower drawers of the whale-like mahogany desk and rummaged around. It was brimful of yellowing newsprint. Eventually he emerged, flourishing a cutting. In our line of endeavour, it is always worth preserving these facts of local history, just in case, he commented. I scanned the article. The driver, Mr. Paul Magwitch, allegedly attempted to brake, but for the victim, Miss Juliet Spence, of Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire, it came too late. Juliet? It didn't ring true somehow. I continued down the page. Miss Spence, who was known to her friends as Jude. That was more like it. Jude, the patron saint of hopeless cases. Jude, the outcast of Oxford, as in the eponymous Thomas Hardy novel. The death of Juliet Spence is a tragedy, a teacher from her former high school, St. Colette's in Sutton Courtenay, commented. She was a promising pupil who had done well in her A-levels. However, the police have since confirmed that Miss Spence had been sleeping rough in Oxford city centre since completing school in the summer of last year. Her parents were unavailable for comment. Evidently, an intelligent girl who went off the rails, most likely thrown out of home. I recalled those predatory eyes, the vivacious music, the sheer lust for life, the need to sate all desires immediately, the ravenous, greedy nature of that teen spirit. Jude was not going to be easy to evict, now that she had found a place to call her own. The afternoon was humdrum, for which I gave silent thanks. Several groups of tourists shuffled in and out, one of them on the Inspector Morse trail. Our shop was featured in one of the television episodes. A couple from Aix-la-Chapelle came in and bought most of our 17th century Dutch bindings, for which they had quite a passion. People popped in and asked me whether we sold maps or phone cards or even umbrellas. Mr. Malinowski worked downstairs. It was all refreshingly mundane. At 6:15, the inimitable Mr. Magwitch burst through the door, seeming at once hyperactive and exhausted. I leapt to my feet and offered him a seat. His breathing was so heavy, I feared that he might have a seizure at any moment. Mr. Malinowski emerged from the vaults, his grey suit surprisingly clean and unrumpled considering he had been bent over his dusty books all day. Shirt white and tie still very purple, the sole concession to personality in his dress. He looked stately, I thought, as he crossed his pig-clad premises and turned the sign around on the door to tell the world that we were closed. He locked up, but we all remained sitting near the window, clearly visible to anyone who might care to glance through the undulating glass. "Please," wheezed Mr. Magwitch, "don't close on my account. I may not be spending much today. That is, I mustn't. I'd like to." His eyes scanned the shelves rapaciously. "Is that a skeleton I see over there?" he cried desperately. Mr. Malinowski walked up behind him and held his hands over the man's skull, or rather, over his crown chakra, as yet unperceived by Magwitch. Then, as he looked at me, there occurred one of the strangest things I have ever experienced. "Visualize a ray of brilliant yellow light entering into my hands," quoth Mr. Malinowski's voice. But his lips did not move. Magwitch was clearly oblivious, but the words still rang loud and clear in my mind. Automatically, I obeyed, feeding into the light all of my empathy and sympathy for this kindly, unfortunate man. Magwitch's face began to relax a little. His breathing steadied as he stared into space. "Now, give me that scene," instructed the voice in my head. Like an actress in her debut with a new producer, I gave it all I was worth. Above our heads, I built the interior of a nightclub, complete with strobe lighting, thumping psychedelic trance music, pulsating pretty bodies, male and female, and neither or both, and a group of happening friends for Jude. They were sitting around a table with bright drinks and dark eyes, elegant gold-tipped and coloured cigarettes swooping on swan-like fingers to painted lips. Their hair was svelte and brightly coloured. A crew from Blade Runner, or The Tribe. Only less naff, and, I was showing off now, fully able to discuss the influence of William Blake on the poetry of Allen Ginsberg. I even managed to weave threads of piquant, uplifting Hindi music into the club drumbeat, while making the imagined group emanate feelings of admiration and goodwill towards our junkie heroine. I made one of them ask her if she'd like another drink. Then, a ghostly voice said, "You are the Lotus Eaters. I cannot come." My vision splintered like an exquisite illuminated window hit by a vandal's brick. Shards of it scattered across the shop desk. "Build her another scenario, quickly," urged Mr. Malinowski, in a tone that made it implicit that I had misjudged the vanity and superficiality of Jude. Mr. Magwitch was fading fast. What could I do? With what could I lure her? If she didn't like my intellectual and sensual pleasure fest, then what? A child like Narnia, perhaps? A heaven for sophisticates? How could I begin to plunder the inner dreams and spiritual building blocks of one whose name and date of death alone were known to me? Mr. Magwitch stirred in his stupor, pale and almost drooling, head lolling to one side. "I'd like to order 1 cathedral, please," he murmured importantly. As he said this, an image arose in my mind of Notre Dame, of all places, Paris at Easter. The altar was drenched in purple mourning. Nuns were singing, chanting of the tears of the Mater Dolorosa, their cold, clear voices piercing the air like arrows of ice. Pergolesi's Stabat Mater sang itself with the clarity of perfect blood singing in my ears. A group processed in concentrated black down the center aisle, veiled, a mass of antimatter, a mass of dissolution, a mass as black as if all funerals ever enacted had been reduced into one dread ritual. The reality of the vision was already taking over the reality of my fragile individuality. My cells were now lending at least half of their pranic energy to the ether. I was dimly perplexed by how swiftly these sounds and images entered my mind and took it over. "Good work. Keep up that Tifereth projection," intoned a voice I thought was the priest's. "It's closer to God than is Yesod, closer to Inri. Suddenly, something entered my vision, something frantic. "Bacchanalia has entered the house of God," cried the nuns. We will not allow this." Sounds, images, and implications fell in quick succession into my mind. It was as if I was dreaming lucidly, yet blessed with an innate understanding of the nature of the symbols. When I saw a thing, I knew exactly what energy it represented. I thought vaguely, it must have been when we were first fully realized. Before dissimulation, I saw a dark shape hurtle up the aisle and land itself at the foot of the altar, a shape about which dark things clung, many-limbed, biting and clawing their host and causing her to thrash her arms about so that she looked half Hindu goddess, half Christian demon. The priest, who wore a bright purple collar, placed his hands on the flailing creature, and as he did so, I noticed that these hands were glowing yellow like candle flame, and that the little clawed and fanged things that clung to her ran like beasts from wildfire when they saw it. The girl struggled beneath the purifying grip, the final vestiges of her past being gradually seared away, his voice urging the exorcism, something about creatures of salt and of water. From the middle of the dissipated husk there emerged a slender flame, many-coloured, face and body dimly visible in its outlines. "My child," said the priest, "leave Malkuth in peace, depart, and enter now another mansion of God. You will have a chance to return later on, when you have rested and reassessed. Lessons learnt. So mote it be," he circumflexed. "Ate, Malkuth, Vigebora, Vigedula, Leolam, Amen," he intoned, with a gravity that would unquestionably move mountains, Himalayan ones, I remember thinking, a low, elevating vibration that I shall never forget. I saw light streaking down to where the thinning flame was, in a terrific bolt. Then it transported her up and up, impossibly high, pulsating with the motion of ascent, and at the top I thought I saw a golden hand reach down to welcome her. "Raphael," the voice boomed. The next thing I knew, I was sitting behind the till at work. I felt exhausted, really quite faint, as one might after a stormy transatlantic flight, nauseous and lagging both physically and mentally. Mr. Magwitch was there, as was a pale, serious-looking Mr. Malinowski, who placed a cup of steaming tea before me, dark and syrupy. "Drink this, my dear," he instructed. I was freezing cold and clutched the hot drink with gratitude. As I gazed over the rim of the mug, I noticed that the clock said 7. Surely not. I had only been visualizing for a few minutes, surely. "You gave us quite a turn there, Viv," admitted Magwitch, sounding much more measured than he usually did. "You fainted, out cold. Eyes stayed open, though, most unnerving. How are you feeling now?" I looked at my boss, who winked at me, clearly not too worried about the hysterics I had apparently displayed. "You must be overwrought, my dear, what with the recent move to Oxford, and it being your first week in this musty old shop. Allergies and fatigue and all sorts. I shouldn't wonder. It's no place for a young lady, really." I protested, thawing out now, and acting my part with aplomb, but of course I was dying to hear what Mr. Malinowski had to say about it all. A glance at our former customer told me that the exorcism had worked, but the details eluded me, and I was concerned for Mr. Magwitch, returning back to Earth to find his life and accounts pillaged and ruined by a spectre. How long would his health last, once he was confronted by the toll of Jude's last 6 wild months? Luckily our companion soon excused himself. Did it work? Why Notre Dame particularly? What will happen when Mr. Magwitch realizes the state of his affairs? I demanded, overstimulated by the experience in conjunction with the caffeine and sugar in the tea. Yes, it worked. Mr. Malinowski lit his pipe and took a deep inhalation. The aromatic smoke billowed from his nose and mouth as he spoke. Juliet was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, and she secretly wished to repent of rather than augment her perceived sins, hence her not following your first astral construct, though it was reasonable of us to assume she would prefer a modern afterlife. And I was impressed by how many concepts you could keep afloat simultaneously, my dear. Jude would have loved what you built for her there. But the eternal side of her personality felt otherwise. Once we got her away from Magwitch's vitality, her spiritual tendencies showed through at last. At first, she wanted through him to buy her way into heaven, but then her true spirit shone through, and she wished only to commit herself to God, as she remembered being taught by the nuns at her school, the nuns who had both taught her and terrified her. That girl was afraid of her own nature. That is why she chose to negate it. However, on allowing herself to be at least par assimilated by the great cosmic consciousness, via what she imagined God to be, her spirit grew one step closer to discovering its way home. She is in very safe hands now. The rest of the process is rather convoluted. involving as it does the evolution of the entire species. Perhaps we should save that conversation for another day. Will Mr. Magwitch be ruined? I asked. Happy for Jude, but concerned for her mauled host. Far from it, replied the mage. What Jude spent was mere peanuts to him, though certainly, if left unchecked, she would have ruined him eventually. No, most of his wealth is bound up in stocks and shares, and he owns a beautiful home which, once he has painted over the fluorescent pinks and peeled away the fake fur, will be worth a fortune. And now, more importantly, his physical health too will be restored. Thank the goddess for that, I said. I'd hate to see him out on the streets like Jude. Ah yes, that was another point. She was never properly mourned, hence the veiled procession in your vision. She needed that to compensate for the fact that her family refused to attend the funeral. They were hurt and angry and embarrassed by her lifestyle and the way she died. I paused for a moment, thinking of my own bizarre experience. Is that how normal magic works? I asked. I didn't even feel as if I was doing much except energizing your hands and watching it all unravel. I could sense the order within the melodrama. Psychodrama, corrected Mr. Malinowski. Thaumaturgic theatre, no less. The key to a very great deal. I pressed on. I wasn't controlling it myself. How did you do it? More smoke issued forth, floating his words. There was much more at work than just we 2 or 3 or 4, my dear. It's taken years of practice and trial and error. However, anyone can get to grips with the mechanics of the universe if they really set their minds to it. You helped, Viv, by sending me the energy that I needed, and by attuning to Jude, a much easier fit for you than for an old man such as myself. You also acted as my eyes. My spiritual lucidity is not what it once was in certain ethers. But ritual itself, though an essential practice in the earlier stages of magic, is no longer necessary to me. You entered the scene I had set mentally, and on that stage, Jude played out the final psychodrama she needed to get onto the next level. 2 pleasantly quiet days later, the door burst open, and in flew Magwitch, at least 8 bags clasped in his hands, his barber flapping. My heart sank. I'm off to Paris with my work, he gushed, but I thought I'd drop these off for you first. They're of no use to me now. Must dash. Regards to Mr. M. Au revoir. He departed as he had arrived, in a flash. I edged around the front of the counter to see what he had deposited there. In bags labelled Viv. I found the clothes in my own size from his boot. At the top of one was the Victorian morning coat I had craved. The vintage Afghan was visible in another. Pure sartorial joy, might I call it sartori? No, that would be very silly indeed. Giddy with excitement, I sent Jude a heartfelt thank you on the ether, slipped the coat on, and wondered what would happen next.